Ida B. Wells' activism really stems from her career as a journalist. And she began to raise the question about why lynching occurred in the South, and particularly to challenge the stereotype of lynching being a result of African-American men raping white women.
Under God, I have done work without any assistance from my own people. And when I think that I have been able to do the work with his assistance, that you could not do if you would, and you would not do if you could, I think I have a right to a feeling of strong indignation. With that, I walked out of the meeting and left them sitting with their mouths open.
Blacks never did really have an opportunity economically to get back into mainstream America.
The end of the Civil War on April 9, 1865, also ended 246 years of slavery for over 4 million African Americans under oppression by white power. Legally stopped from education and economic opportunities under captivity, the race moved swiftly to take advantage of new rights extended under the Constitution. President Abraham Lincoln and Congress passed landmark legislation.
One of the things that we'll find is that Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, was definitely paying attention to not offending the South, but at the same time ridding the nation of the stain of black slavery.
But Southern states, however, resented this new black equality and worked to undermine national laws during this period known as Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1875. Hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged and used violent methods such as lynching to discourage African Americans from exercising their new rights. The race was voting in large numbers to elect legislators that delivered benefits in their neighborhoods. But white Southern racists were fearful that African Americans would gain too much political and economic power. So they took steps, often violent, to take the vote and suppress freedom. African Americans who dared to vote were injured or murdered. But this didn't frighten them off. They kept voting to elect men like Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who served as state senator and lieutenant governor of Louisiana during Reconstruction.
One of the things that blacks found was that even though they had been given rights by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, they found that the Supreme Court, which was at that time the highest court, or which is at this time the highest court in the land, is really not committed to effectively give blacks or to assure that blacks have these opportunities.
The national government ignored these blatant violations against African Americans. Rights that the race had earned were taken away by 1900 in the South. Frequent violence against them grew. It became commonplace. Racist white mobs went on killing sprees, murdering unarmed African American men, women, and children. Lynching happened so often that it became an accepted reality in African American life. The perpetrators were not stopped by legal authorities at the state or federal levels.
Ida B. Wells, born into slavery, rose to challenge this brutality, and her work brought worldwide attention to the lynching issue. Born July 16, 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, she was the oldest of 8 children. Her parents, both former slaves, strongly stressed education and self-esteem to their children. Because of this kind of nurturing, Wells had a great thirst for knowledge. She graduated from Rust College in Holly Springs and stretched herself by taking extra classes whenever she could to sharpen her skills. After passing the teaching test by the fall of 1884, Wells was teaching in Memphis City schools. She also wrote for a church paper, and her talents attracted the attention of the Free Speech newspaper. They made her an offer to be an editor, and she accepted. Her brief teaching career ended in 1891 when Wells was fired in the all-black Memphis school system for writing an article in the Free Speech that criticized the poor conditions for students. After being dismissed, she started writing full-time, and she saved what she could to buy an interest in the newspaper. Traveling on one of her regular trips for subscribers in Natchez, Mississippi in 1892, she heard about another horrible lynching in Memphis. This time, 3 African-American males who owned a business had been murdered by a white mob. They were close friends of Wells. During this era, African-Americans who dared to go into business risked being killed.
They had located their grocery in the district known as the Curve because the streetcar line curved sharply at that point. There was already a grocery owned and operated by a white man who hitherto had had a monopoly on the trade of this thickly populated colored suburb. Thomas's grocery changed all that, and he and his associates were made to feel that they were not welcome by the white grocer. The district being mostly colored, and many of the residents belonging either to Thomas's church or to his lodge, he was not worried by the white grocer's hostility. One day, some colored and white boys quarreled over a game of marbles, and the colored boys got the better of the fight, which followed. The father of the white boys whipped the victorious colored boy, whose father and friends pitched in to avenge the grown white man's flogging of a colored boy. The colored men won the fight, whereupon the white father and grocery keeper swore out a warrant for the arrest of the colored victors. Of course, the colored grocery keepers had been drawn into the dispute, but the case was dismissed with nominal fines. Then the challenge was issued that the vanquished whites were coming on Saturday night to clean out People's Grocery Company. Knowing this, the owners of the company consulted a lawyer and were told that they were outside the city limits and beyond police protection. They would be justified in protecting themselves if attacked. Accordingly, the grocery company armed several men and stationed them in the rear of the store on that fatal Saturday night, not to attack, but to repel a threatened attack. And Saturday night was the time when men of both races congregated in their respective groceries. About 10 o'clock that night, when Thomas was posting his books for the week, and Calvin McDowell and his clerk were waiting on customers preparatory to closing, shots rang out in the back room of the store. The men stationed there had seen several white men stealing through the rear door and fired on them without a moment's notice. 3 of these men were wounded, and others fled and gave the alarm. Sunday morning's paper came out with lurid headlines telling how officers of the law had been wounded while in discharge of their duties, hunting up criminals whom they had been told were harbored in the People's Grocery Company. This being a low dive in which drinking and gambling were carried on, a resort of thieves and thugs. So ran the description in the leading white journals of Memphis of this successful effort of decent black men to carry on a legitimate business. The same newspaper told of the arrest and jailing of the proprietor of the store and many of the colored people. They predicted that it would go hard with the ringleaders if these officers should die. The tale of how the peaceful homes of that suburb were raided on that quiet Sunday morning by police pretending to be looking for others who were implicated, and what the papers had called a conspiracy, has often been told. Over 100 colored men were dragged from their homes and put in jail on suspicion. All day long on that fateful Sunday, white men were permitted in the jail to look over the imprisoned black men. Frenzied descriptions and hearsays were detailed in the papers, which fed the fires of sensationalism. Groups of white men gathered on the street corners and meeting places to discuss the awful crime of Negroes shooting white men. There had been no lynchings in Memphis since the Civil War, but the colored people felt that anything might happen during the excitement. The manhood which these Negroes represented went to the county jail and kept watch Sunday night. This they did also on Monday night, guarding the jail to see that nothing happened to the colored men during this time of race prejudice, while it was thought that the wounded white men would die. On Tuesday morning, the newspaper which had fanned the flame of race prejudice announced that the wounded men were out of danger and would recover. The colored men who had guarded the jail for 2 nights felt that the crisis was past, that they need not guard the jail the 3rd night. While they slept, a body of picked men was admitted to the jail, which was a modern Bastille. This mob took out their cells Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, the 3 officials of the People's Grocery Company. They were loaded on a switch engine of the railroad, which ran back of the jail, carried a mile north of the city limits, and horribly shot to death. One of the newspapers held back its edition in order to supply its readers with the details of that lynching. From its columns was gleaned the above information, together with details which told that it is said that Tom Moss begged for his life for the sake of his wife and child and his unborn baby. That when asked if he had anything to say, he told them to tell my people go west. There is no justice for them here. That Calvin McDowell got hold of one of the guns of the lynchers, and because they could not loosen his grip, a shot was fired into his closed fist. When the 3 bodies were found, the fingers of McDowell's right hand had been shot to pieces, and his eyes were gouged out. This proved that the one who wrote that news report was either an eyewitness or got the facts from someone who was. The shock to the colored people who knew and loved both Moss and McDowell was beyond description. Groups of them went to the grocery and elsewhere and vented their feelings in talking amongst themselves, but they offered no violence. Word was brought to the city hall that Negroes were massing at the curb where the grocery had been located. Immediately an order was issued by the judge of the criminal court sitting on the bench, who told the sheriff to take 100 men, go out to the curb at once, and shoot down on sight any Negro who appears to be making trouble. The loafers around the corner quickly spread the news, and gangs of them rushed into the hardware stores, armed themselves, boarded the cars, and rushed out to the curb. They obeyed the judge's orders literally, and shot into any group of Negroes they saw with as little compunction as if they had been on a hunting trip. The only reason hundreds of Negroes were not killed on that day by the mobs was because of the forbearance of the colored men. They realized their helplessness and submitted to outrages and insults for the sake of those dependent upon them. This mob took possession of the People's Grocery Company, helping themselves to food and drink, and destroyed what they could not eat or steal. The creditors had the place closed, and a few days later, what remained of the stock was sold at auction. Thus, with the aid of the city and county authorities and daily papers, the white grocer had indeed put an end to his rival Negro grocer, as well as to his business.
In Memphis, Wells' article inspired African Americans to pack up, and this caused the white-owned streetcar system to lose large sums of money because ridership was low. Two City Railroad Company representatives visited Wells in her office and asked her for help at getting African Americans to ride. Wells